Okay, let me start the program then. Sarwar, uh, we can go. Okay. Good evening, good morning. Thank you very much for joining this program. I am Famida Khatun, the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. On behalf of the Center for Policy Dialogue, Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka, and the Southern Voice, I welcome you to this webinar, which is titled Recovery of the Apparel Sectors of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka from the COVID-19 Crisis. Is a value chain based solution possible? So at the outset, I must mention that today's program is being organized jointly by CPD, IPS, and the SB, Southern Voice, and researchers from the Center for Policy Dialogue and Institute of Policy Studies have recently conducted a joint study with the support from the Southern Voice. Southern Voice is a network of 51 think tanks of the global South. You might know of this network. So basically, the study has looked into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the apparel sector. And we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on the national and global economy severely. And almost all the sectors of the economy have been affected. And global apparel value chain has also experienced disruption from this pandemic. And the scale of this disruption is going to be severe and very large and huge. And also this is going to have an impact on the not only on the growth of the economy, but it is also going to have impact on the employment and income from the short to medium term. And if we do not address the recovery in a sustainable manner, this is going to have a medium term impact on achieving other goals. For example, the sustainable development goals, which are connected to reducing poverty or eliminating poverty, having a zero hunger, gender equality, decent work, economic growth, and also the areas of industry, innovation, and infrastructure. All these SDGs are going to be challenged in view of this impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this study, which have been undertaken based on a survey of multiple stakeholders in the sector, this study analyzed the potential of a value chain-based solution to support the recovery of the local apparel sector in view of the ongoing pandemic. And today's webinar has the objective to share the findings of the study with the broader stakeholders, with the policymakers, with the buyers, with the manufacturers, with the workers in the industry, and also the academia and experts to share the insights with them, and also get their insights on how to recover the sector in a sustainable manner, and how to also undertake responsible business practices. And this is expected from the major market players who have a stake in also in the businesses of the apparel sector in these two countries. So in today's dialogue, we have a number of very important speakers. The presentations will be made by one presentation, which will be made by CPD and IPS researchers. And then there is a distinguished panelist. I wouldn't introduce them because we have a moderator. The session is going to be moderated by Professor Mustafizur Rahman, who is the Distinguished Fellow, Center for Policy Dialogue. I would now hand over to him to moderate the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Famida. I would like to join Dr. Famida in extending a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of CPD, Dr. Famida, our Executive Director, and also Executive Director of Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Dushni. And as Dr. Famida mentioned, our partner is Southern Voice, and I would like to extend warm welcome on behalf of the chair of the Southern Voice, Dr. Deopriya Bhattacharya, and Andrea Ordinez. She's director of Southern Voice. She is also with us here. So warm welcome, dear audience, and we do hope that you will be with us because the topic of today's discussion is very important. We are passing through a second wave of COVID. So how this important sector will sustain this pandemic, and how do we make it a part of building back better? That's the stake, the high stake, which is here. And I think that the topic is very important also in the sense that all the nodal points and the stakeholders along the value chain have been affected by the pandemic, be it producers, brands and buyers, retailers, consumers, workers, the governments involved in our country. All of them, all of us, we have been affected. And we will also need to be part of the solution. So how do we then apportion the responsibilities along the value chain so that we can have a sustainable apparel sector in our countries, and also we can look forward to the sustainability of the apparel sector itself. So from that perspective, this is very important. I am very happy to see that we have been joined by our distinguished panelists. I will introduce them as we go forward. I can see that CPD distinguished member, Board of Trustees, Mr. Saidur Zaman, our former finance minister, he is here with us. I don't know, our chairman, Professor Hemant Sobhan, hopefully will also join us. As Dr. Fahmida mentioned, this study is a joint study by the CPD and the IPS. There is a study team. On behalf of the team, the presentation will be made by Dr. Khondokar Ghulam Moazzam, Research Director, CPD, and Mr. Kitmina Hawez, Research Economist, IPS. So without much ado, I would like to invite the two presenters to present their findings, Dr. Moazzam and Mr. Kitmina.
Thank you, Professor Mustafiz. Irtiza, can you share the presentation now? Okay. Can you make it larger? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, audience, for joining today's very important webinar. This presentation will jointly be made by myself and Mr. Kitmina Hawez from IPS. Please, next slide. This is the study team for the study. Myself, Dr. Fahmida, Kitmina, Tamim, and Anjana were the team. And we especially thanks to Abro and Aisha from IPS for providing necessary supports for various kinds of issues related to the study. Second, yeah, why this study? I think this is important to take into account that lots of studies have taken place so far with regard to the global value chain, particularly on the ready-made garment value chain. But from that point of view, I think this study is different in the sense it has taken into account a whole value chain approach. Instead of actually taking the buyer's concerns or the supplier's concerns, this study actually undertake the study from a whole value chain point of view, taking into account all the challenges confronted by the market agents. It has tried to find out the problems, and thereby the next point is that try to find out a value chain based solution. This is different in the sense that usually the solution so far approach at a national level or at the downstream of the value chain by the buyers, and various kinds of solution usually proposed and undertook. But from that point of, from there, this is different in the sense that it is taken a solution from a whole value chain point of view. So let me actually come that point. And my colleague Kitmina will present the 5 key findings of the study. And based on that, we like to present you some sorts of a framework of cooperation within the value chain, some newer approach, whether we could actually thought of, whether brand buyers and suppliers and the sourcing country governments and the supplying country governments jointly undertake some sorts of a newer approach for this longer term recovery period, some sorts of a sustainable solution. Next. And we all understand that how the global value chain of the ready-made garment sector has been affected because of the COVID pandemic, and this has affected both the upstream and on the downstream of the value chain. Both the brand buyers as well as the suppliers and workers all have been affected. Against that, the initiatives undertaken at the national level, we found those are inadequate. Those are largely short-term in nature and have very limited long-term impact and implications for the suppliers, for the workers, as well as for other market agents. So from that point of view, I think this is a challenging part when the second phase of corona pandemic has started and the recovery now appears to be more longish. Now the challenges are much more deeper, and we thought that we need to take it in a newer perspective. And most importantly, the fiscal constraints of many apparel supplying countries is a major challenge. And you all understand that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and other supplying countries have very limited fiscal capacity to support their workers, to support their entrepreneurs. So they all undertook some initiatives, but those are very much of credit-based in nature and of very short-termish, and very limited impact and implications for longer-term problems and challenges. And what we are actually currently notice, if this pandemic prolonged and the medium-term challenges extended, which will cause the demand slump at the consumer's end, that will close more shops and at the retailers' end, that will affect the buyers and brand strategies, and finally that will affect the suppliers as well. So need to have some sorts of a innovative approach in terms of medium-term recovery. But what the recovery measures currently undertook, we thought that those are not actually affecting or positively contributing the whole supply chain. We noticed that there are inventory smoothening initiatives. There are lots of stock of inventory in the suppliers' end, and buyers took initiative to smoothen those inventories. Those are of a short-term nature. There are initiatives for reshoring in order to consider the vulnerability in the supply chain. Buyers reshored a part of their orders to regional sources. And also the alternate location strategy is also taken by brands buyers to concentrate more reliable fuel sources that also have undertaken during this time. And all these are more considered to be of a downward stream approach, or meaning that brands and buyers' point of view, those initiatives are quite okay, but more of an individual point of view, those may be sustainable. But what about the whole supply chain? Next. And from that point of view, we thought that a value chain based solution, something new, need to be thought of. And for that, we have proposed here some collective action under a market-based frame, where the market players will explore solutions which will enable the stakeholders to cope with the crisis, to rebound and recover, and to be resilient. So that is the whole theme of it. It will not actually consider an individual based solution, either at a national level or at the buyer's end, but it will consider the whole supply chain together and try to find out some sorts of a solution. If it is feasible, we like to hear from the brand buyers representatives here and also from other distinguished panelists whether these kinds of solution is possible, or what sorts of other initiatives could be undertaken along with that. So with these words, I am now actually handed over to Mr. Kitmina to present the 5 key findings of this study.
Thank you, Dr. Mosam. Could we move to the next slide, please? Right. So let me present the 5 key findings from our case, from our research that was done. The first is a lack of preparation on part of suppliers in terms of crisis management and resilience in terms of increasing capacity. Now, of course, COVID-19 was unprecedented. No one expected it, unless you probably listen to people like Bill Gates about the impending potential for pandemics a few years ago. But I think the scope of this pandemic was not expected. The last previous crisis that we had was the 2008 financial crisis, where we saw a similar domino effect taking place, where falling apparel demand or kind of an economic crisis in the developed countries would lead to a domino effect in terms of the cancellation or deferment of orders, a reduction in suppliers' revenue, and layoffs and retrenchment, etc. Now, one thing that we found here is that companies, regardless of whether they had adapted after 2008, 2009 or not, were affected. That is not the question. But companies that had taken certain measures to improve their resilience capacity were able to mitigate the impacts much better than companies that did not. So companies which had stocks in advance or kind of had diversified their product basket, etc., and particularly diversified their export markets, etc., were better at adapting to the situation and reducing the impact, the negative impact of the pandemic-led issues than companies that did not. Next slide, please. The second finding was in terms of the limitation of national level policies because of fiscal constraints. Now, the fiscal constraints of developing countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are well documented. In terms of a comparison, Bangladesh had a broader basket of policy tools available to support the apparel sector, and I think the economy overall. They were able to provide much more fiscal stimulus to the economy. Whereas Sri Lanka's issues with limited fiscal space and debt is well documented. So Sri Lanka tended to rely more towards monetary policy and things like debt moratoriums that were rolled over every 6 months and are now currently in the third rollover of 6 months right now. There were also short-term working capital loans at a subsidized rate, whereas Bangladesh would also provide things like subsidized credit as workers' wages and so on. However, there were structural issues that would lead to these policies not taking the desired effect. For example, in Bangladesh, we saw subsidized credit support not necessarily flowing into the hands of workers, whereas in Sri Lanka, the things like working capital loans were available only at a limited capacity to certain companies who had the sort of existing banking connections, and also banks were more and more risk averse as time progressed, and particularly as the pandemic continued. So there were structural issues, and particularly small and medium enterprises found it more difficult to access some of these policies that were taking place at the national level. Next slide, please. The third thing was with regards to the state of the world of work. Now, first and foremost, we saw at a common level broad temporary job losses, and sometimes some permanent job losses as well. And almost all the companies that we surveyed had wage cuts from the most senior levels to the junior levels. Now, the problem with this was that it was not only a matter of export revenue to the company or kind of wage cuts to the workers, but also it also affected the socioeconomic conditions of these workers. So we saw things like increased indebtedness amongst workers because of more borrowings, particularly from the informal sector or pawning jewelry, etc., and also a broader reduction and deterioration of their food intake in terms of their family as well as themselves individually. So even though at times the government and at times companies were providing some support to these workers, they tended to be limited in scope, and particularly because of the fiscal constraints of both companies as well as governments, this support was short term. So it would last at most about 3 months, and particularly given the way the pandemic has been playing out now, we saw a limitation in terms of how much that support was helpful in regards to that. Secondly, in terms of the regularity of inspecting the health conditions that were imposed during the pandemic, for example, we saw those, particularly in Sri Lanka, for example, we saw those regulations being taken into consideration quite strictly at the outset of the pandemic. However, particularly around the July to August or July to September period, when the first wave of COVID-19 was under control, there was a sense of complacency amongst all stakeholders across the supply chain that unfortunately led to the second wave that took place in the industry, and then kind of was part of the industry and the industry across the country as well. So now we've gone back to more strict inspections and so on, but there's a situation where we see some complacency coming in, and therefore there are regulatory gaps as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the medium-term recovery, this is particularly affected by the second wave. Now, this has affected Bangladesh and Sri Lanka somewhat differently because Bangladesh, we saw, has been able to more or less continue their production processes amidst the somewhat second wave that has taken place, whereas Sri Lanka was taking a strict lockdown approach when it came to the second wave, which meant that a lot of companies, and there was a lot of disruption to the production process and supply chain, domestic supply chain, from around October onwards. So this has somewhat affected the ability of Sri Lankan suppliers to provide for the demand that is coming from other countries. Of course, the fact that, next slide, please. Of course, the fact that the COVID-19 vaccine coming up has improved, provides some improvement or some hope for improvement. However, for example, there have been some disruptions to the vaccine being given. So this is a cause for concern and is prolonging the issue at hand. Now, one thing that was interesting to note here was the supply chain that occurs from China. Now, if you remember back to when COVID-19 started and China went into lockdown, this was also more or less the time of the Chinese New Year. So we saw that Sri Lankan suppliers, for example, had excess supply of raw materials at the outset of the pandemic during the January to March period, and therefore was able to kind of address some of the supply constraints that took place when China went into lockdown. But that ability or the decision making was somewhat different when it came to Bangladesh at the time. However, once, of course, China was getting back online, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and all of the other countries went into lockdown since March onwards. Next slide, please. So overall, we've seen, and the final finding is that we've seen limited initiatives undertaken across the value chain, and then these initiatives have been more or less been specific to national initiatives or company-specific initiatives. So, for example, we saw several brands reconfiguring their supply chains or their way of decision making. They have given greater responsibility to the country team, whereas they have downsized their local headquarters team, and also in terms of the usage of online platforms to do things like fit-ons and so on, and using e-commerce as well. And there is a growing, and particularly when it came to certain suppliers, they are also now trying to cater to the domestic market, particularly for Sri Lanka during that period where we were getting back to normal between July and September, where the international market was still in lockdown or was suffering. Exporters were trying to realign towards the domestic market to try and support that. We've also seen some initiatives, for example, the ILO DIFE initiative and so on. However, overall, across the value chain, we have seen weaknesses or somewhat limited scope, and that has led to the domino effect that I spoke about earlier. So I will now give back the floor to Dr. Moses.
Thank you, Kitmina. Next slide, please. And from that point of view, I think we understand from Kitmina's presentation that those which have been undertaken so far is much appreciated, but those are not adequate enough for the enterprises to continue a prolonged case of pandemic, which is now likely to be over a year or more. So we need to have some sorts of a solution need to be think internally within the value chain. And our proposal is that whether a value chain based initiative could better distribute the orders within the supply chain, and that could contribute more in the recovery process. And what we did for this, next slide please, is that we have analyzed the distribution of the orders of top 20 major suppliers of meat and oven products during pre-COVID period and the COVID period in June 2020. The left side figure shows the distribution of the orders. The left side bar shows the meat products. Upper left hand side shows the meat products distribution. While you see the red figure is showing the China's share, which has during the COVID period has further increased from 35% to 39%. And same is true for some other European countries, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. They have also gained share in the market for the meat products, and this is also true for the oven products as well. On the other hand, some of the traditional supplying countries has lost their market share. For example, Bangladesh has lost market share of 2% in case of the meat products and 1% in case of the oven products. And the same is for the Sri Lanka. It has lost 1% each market share for meat and oven products in case of the pre-COVID period and during the COVID pandemic period. Next slide, please. So from that point of view, we think that this reshoring strategy that has been undertaken or the alternate further concentration of China has reduced and squeezed the orders to major traditional countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And if these orders come to these countries at a pre-COVID level share distribution, that could help these countries to operate and to provide their workers the wages and to continue their businesses during this challenging period. And from that point of view, we have done the analysis and we have found that during this period, if the orders from the brand buyers have just retained to the pre-COVID period, a $2 billion worth of orders can be shifted from China to other countries. So you can easily imagine this 2 billion worth of orders can be distributed to the country like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Cambodia and in India as well, in order to better continue their operations during this period. And more importantly, these countries have the capacity to produce these orders. Can you go back to the earlier slide? And you see the right side columns. It shows the Bangladesh's performance, top 5 products in meat products and oven products, and same is true for oven products for Sri Lanka. And here also, in all categories of products, China is there, and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka has all the capacities to produce those products. So these countries have the capacity if these orders redistributed to these countries, and these countries could produce those very well. Next slide. Next slide. And from that point of view, we think there is a process, and there's an alternative to think of a joint commitment from the brands buyer side, particularly from the Europe and USA, and from the governments of the sourcing countries, to undertake some sorts of a redistribution of the orders, try to gradually return to the pre-COVID level market shares. We know that the consumers are now demanding less, but within that less pie, whether the pre-COVID distribution level could be retained or not. If that retention could be possible, then these orders could better support to the manufacturers of these countries. And we also like to mention here is that these countries where now the orders are going, particularly to China, Vietnam, they are they are benefited through these orders. But at the same time, we also like to mention that these countries' social support scheme is quite strong. For example, China's social protection scheme has been further widened in order to cover unemployed workers and providing the unemployed insurance for these workers for another 6 months. And for Vietnam also, they have taken a insurance scheme which will cover 50% of the total eligible workers by 2020 and 100% by 2030. So these initiatives will also support these countries like to better handle their initial worker-related or employers-related issues. But countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, which have limited social support programs and which doesn't have cover workers within that social support scheme. For example, there is no such unemployment insurance scheme for the workers, except that recently Bangladesh has initiated it with the support of the European Union and the German support. But there is no such actually extended insurance scheme for these countries. So what we actually like to propose, next slide, is that, next slide. What we like to propose is that it is a joint collaborative effort is needed from the suppliers, from the brand buyers, in order to gradually move from COVID period to pre-COVID level, the bottom triangle we are showing, by undertaking better redistribution of the orders in one hand, as well as providing various kinds of social support from the sourcing country government in order to ensure the unemployed workers' livelihood concerns, as well as providing training and other facilities in order to explore new employment opportunities during this time of challenging period. We think that such kinds of redistributive initiatives under a very much of a market-based frame could better facilitate of a longer-term challenge during these medium-term concerns in the global apparel value chain. And with these words, I like to conclude here. And thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muazzam. Thank you, Mr. Kitmina, for that excellent presentation. Dear audience, I think we all should appreciate the very insightful observations and analysis that has been presented by Dr. Muazzam and Kitmina as part of the study. Well, we appreciate that the pandemic has hit all the nodal points along the value chain, and we also appreciate that the governments and the entrepreneurs have limitations with regard to addressing the emerging challenges. So from that perspective, what the authors are proposing is a very innovative approach. I must say, I try to follow this discourse, and I think that the proposition with regard to helping with extended insurance scheme, or not asking for discount or deferring the orders, I think that's something that we can discuss, and we know that companies like H&M have done that. But with regard to the proposal of restoring the pre-COVID share through redistribution of orders away from China and Vietnam, will of course require a lot of changes, not from single brand buyer, but as a collective. So these are very interesting proposals. To what extent these are possible, that will be one question that I will request my panelists to think about and share their opinion about. I think this is very innovative, but at the same time, I also understand that it is very challenging also, because brands and buyers tend to be guided by competitive prices, but whether in view of COVID, they can change their strategy and go on for more of a social welfare type of redistributive justice. So that is something that we will have to think about, and we will request our panelists also to share their thoughts on. We also have seen how the relative, resilience of Bangladesh apparel sector and Sri Lankan apparel sector. That was also very insightful and interesting. So thank you, Dr. Mozam. Thank you, Kitmina, for that excellent presentation. We have, dear audience, 5 very distinguished panelists with us, and I will introduce them as I go forward. They include entrepreneurs, big and small. They include thinkers, who have been writing and advocating sustainability of apparel's value chain and apparel's ecosystem. We have representative from one of the major buyers in Bangladesh, which accounts for, I think, about 10% of total business of $33 billion in Bangladesh. I'm talking about H&M. And also we have the ILO, which is, of course, doing a lot of work in terms of advancing the interests of the workers and also the sector itself. So very rich panel. And of course, we will welcome your comments as well. And now let me request Mr. Husni Saleh, who is Director Strategic Transformation of Mass Holdings, which is a major Mass Holdings is a major apparels enterprise group in Sri Lanka. And my question to Mr. Husni Saleh will be, Mr. Saleh, you have heard the presentation. So as an entrepreneur and as a group, how did your company adjust during the COVID? Did you get any support from the brands and buyers? What is your opinion? What else they could have done or can do now as we face the second wave of pandemic? So if you could share your thoughts in about 7 minutes, I will be very grateful.
Sure, thank you, Professor Rahman. And I'd just like to start off by appreciating the organizers and the presenters of today's discussion for setting up this webinar. And I honestly believe that forums like this that promote constructive dialogue often pave the way for meaningful change. So I'm happy to be a part of it. So I think, if you'd allow me, I'd like to just, talk a little bit about MAS's experience over the next few minutes in dealing with the pandemic, and also touch on by drawing relevance to some of the points that have been raised in today's discussion, right, in what has been proposed. 3 broad points. Firstly, for those of you who aren't familiar with MAS, the organization that I represent is a design to delivery apparel solutions provider, whose core business is in manufacturing apparel, or ready-made garments as we call it. And we're headquartered in Sri Lanka, have about 50 manufacturing facilities across 17 countries. We employ about 99,000 people globally, and we manufacture garments for some of the world's leading intimate apparel, sports and swimwear brands like Victoria's Secret, Nike, Lululemon, Speedo, etc. So looking at just 3 points that I wanted to raise in how our experience of the pandemic also relates to this value chain based conversation. And then I'll get to answering the question that the professor posed as well. Firstly, the first most, I think, pertinent point is that any value chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And the overall value that the value chain can create is truly optimized only when stakeholders work collaboratively together, and especially during a time of crisis. And we experienced this firsthand. When the pandemic hit us, it didn't just hit us in waves, but it hit us in different parts of the apparel value chain. And for us, we had initially, when China went on lockdown, January, February of last year, we had raw material disruptions because our suppliers were affected. So we couldn't, that led to our manufacturing plants being open and us not being able to deliver on committed customer orders. The second phase was more about our demand side, where key markets like the US and EU go into lockdown, and then the demand for orders, kind of fell off a cliff. And so we had open capacity and we had to push back on our suppliers and orders that were live at the time. And finally, we had a phase where Sri Lanka went into lockdown, where you had our apparel manufacturing facilities coming to a grinding halt despite having live orders to deliver on and supply chain raw materials that were readily available. So we got hit every which way you can imagine, right? And I think the first point that I raised is, it is through the collaborative efforts of these key stakeholders that we were able to navigate through this immediate crisis. Our key customers were flexible. I have to give credit where credit is due. Our customers were flexible in accepting these delayed deliveries. They worked closely with us in reprioritizing shipments and even encouraged us to leverage the opportunity around digital e-commerce sales, where they gave us, some orders and helped us align with that opportunity. Suppliers prioritized our raw material for us and worked around the clock to improve deliveries. And even our government, evolved their approach in managing the pandemic over time across the first and second waves here in Sri Lanka, to ensure that the country not only saved lives but actually saved livelihoods as well. And that's a fine balance to strike. So we ourselves worked openly. This first point is that we worked openly and transparently with our stakeholders across the value chain, and we had a trust-based collaborative approach, which was why I feel that we were able to minimize the disruption and optimize the value that we created across the value chain during this crisis. So that's point number one, right? We have to work collaboratively to minimize disruption. The second point is that risk mitigation in the medium term, for me, is more about building resilience within the value chain than merely shifting your supply base, or you're looking for alternative supply sources, like what was presented. While some customers found themselves overexposed to a few sourcing countries or organizations during this crisis, the majority of our key brands already had relatively diversified sourcing footprints, right? However, in search of, let's say, operational stability or risk mitigation, in the immediate crisis, some customers explored moving orders to new locations, right? And whilst this may provide temporary relief, in the short run, there are no guarantees that the rising COVID infection rates will not pose a threat to these new locations in the future, given the evolving nature of the pandemic. Or that these new sourcing locations wouldn't open up to other risks that are non-COVID related. And the cost of switching also is something that is considerable for brands to think through before making those calls, right? So with these similar kind of limitations associated with reshoring and regionalization, the supply chain strategies can be limited in their ability to offer true risk mitigation in the medium term. Instead, building resilience within a relatively diversified but existing value chain, such that it has the capability to face both current and future crises successfully, is now increasingly being seen by people in the value chain as a preferred alternative. So, for example, during this crisis, MAS built operational resilience in a number of ways. We strengthened our COVID risk assessment protocol, implemented strict health and safety SOPs across our businesses. We created bio bubbles and zoning within factory floors. We had factory within factory concepts, so that even if one of our team members tested positive, the rest of the factory outside of that zone or that area could still operate. So we found ways to optimize our manufacturing capacity across the entire scale of our group and move orders relatively quickly between plants. Understand? So with all these different ways in building resilience, we feel that can truly, building operational stability and resilience can truly be the way through which we achieve risk mitigation over and above moving supply locations or other supply chain strategies. The final point is that in any medium-term value chain solution, you need to consider what the post-crisis value chain is starting to look like and emerging. What are these, and what does that mean for stakeholders like us in the value chain? And I think whatever we're proposing as a medium-term solve, we need to be cognizant on how the traditional value chain is evolving and what the role on each of our stakeholders, like ourselves, will need to play in the future. Otherwise, we risk being disrupted overall. So, in closing, it's a transformative time for us in the industry. And I think the opportunity to create and capture value has never been more profound. And if you look at what the customers and in what is being presented also, what we're asking for is a very good, and I think, a socially acceptable request. However, if it does not solve the burning problems of all stakeholders, including the customers, who also, let's not forget, at the start of the pandemic, the statistics said that key customers were going, about 1/3 of these customers were going to go out of business. These retail brands were going to go out of business. So it's something that we need to be considerate and understanding of as well, as we find the full solution, a value chain based solution. And so to finally just answer the question very briefly that was posed, our customers, we had two types of customers. Most of our key customers chose to partner with us and help build value chain based solutions in terms of how to risk mitigate and face the crisis together, both in the short term as well as looking at the longer term. But there were customers who took a more enterprise centric view because it meant their survival, life or death. And we have to be understanding of that. And I think most of our customers, whether it come to negotiating lead times or looking at better credit terms, etc., there's a bunch of tools that we can work with customers, which I can get into over maybe the Q&A part of this segment. I don't want to take more time, but I wanted to leave these 3 points that reflect our experience in relation to the value chain piece that we're discussing today. So I'll hand it back to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hosni Saleh. That was really very insightful. Thank you for sharing your experience. And you are very right that the traditional value chain is evolving because of the pandemic. And we must explore opportunities of socially acceptable and socially responsible practices. I think that conclusion is also very important. Thank you so much. I will now request our second distinguished panelist, Mr. Mustafizuddin, who is founder and CEO of Bangladesh Apparels Exchange. Mr. Mustafiz is a very powerful voice in terms of advancing the cause of sustainable apparels ecosystem, writes a lot. He is a very strong advocate of sustainability of the value chain. And I would now like to request Mr. Mustafiz to reflect on your experience and with regard to whether the brands and buyers being major players in the value chain, have they played their role in the context of COVID and in terms of the sort of resilience and resilient recovery that we are thinking about? What is your take on that, Mr. Mustafiz?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Actually, if I share my experiences, what happened during this pandemic, I will say that this is something which I never thought, and this is something which I think nobody should ever experience this kind of experiences, what I had already. Customers who are being working like 20 years, 15 years together, within a moment of minute, they just change their entire so-called relationship, partnership, and all the pitch word, what we always used to hear, we will be working together long term, we are like a family, all these kinds of words. Unfortunately, when the COVID started, all in a sudden, all the orders had been cancelled, payment had been delayed. Whatever the goods I shipped, I will not share here anything about other experiences or something from my personal experiences. I have one customer where I shipped the goods 1 year already in USA. Still now I had not received more than $2 million of payment. I have one customer which is very famous. All of you know Topshop, Topman, Arcadia Group, $3 million cancelled. And the most disappointed and most painful things for me, I had not even get a reply from my so-called long-term partners. Even they had not feel accountability, where they talks a lot about accountability, that one email we sent to our partners and say, hello Mustafiz, this is the things happening, this is the things happen, can we talk? We talk a lot about in our industry collective bargaining. When it comes to there, we have a lot of advocacy from brands and retailers to do this with our workers. But unfortunately, we don't have the experience from our brands and retailers. We not got only even an email from them about these issues. So it's a very painful experiences, and we could have overcome this type of situation if we really have a small conversations and a cooperation in between us, and that's the only way to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a follow-up question. Of course, your experience is, I think, common for many of the entrepreneurs in Bangladesh, and I'm sure also for in Sri Lanka as well. But going forward, do you think that it is possible for the major brands and buyers to shift their position given the experience of COVID? Because it's a collaborative effort which will be required for the sustainability of the sector. If the entrepreneurs don't survive, the brands buyers also survive. And now, are you skeptical about going forward as skeptical as you have been in terms of your experience, or there are some hopes?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, maybe all of you will not like it, but I am zero hope. I have zero hope. The reason why I have zero hope: last 5 years I spoke 94 conferences and 27 countries. At every conferences, whatever the topics I said, I still see, when I see my video, when I see my news, I just ask myself what I am doing and what I really doing. And it's time to reflect on myself, what I am doing. Let's talk about COVID. When COVID started, I have an interview in BBC. I have a and then people start to talk about it. Then Guardian. I faced a lot of social challenges, lots of problems, which I don't want to tell today. But in spite of that, I keep on talking about all these things. 1 year gone. If you ask me, okay, Mustafiz, what had been changed? Nothing. Contact is still the same thing. Payment terms is still the same thing. Lead time is still the same thing. What had been changed? Nothing changed. So I really have a very small hope to do that. And regarding that partnership, when we talk about the partnership, first of all, our brands and retailer have to consider us as a partner. And I have doubt very few buyers and retailers, very few consider manufacturer as their partner. So we can expect these things from our manufacturing partners when they also consider us as a partner. This is my thinking.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mustafiz. I think your experience and your insights are very important, because we know that you have been pursuing the cause of the sector and the workers and the domestic suppliers for a long time, and but we still would like to think that your last sentence, that they will have to consider us as partners. I think that's the window that we have in going forward. Thank you very much. Please be with us. There may be some questions from the audience as well. I would like to invite Ms. Binu Wickramasinghe. She is co-founder and managing director of the Design Collective Store of in Sri Lanka. She is a small entrepreneur. So when we talk about the apparel sector, sometimes we concentrate mostly on big suppliers, but on the other hand, the small players have also been very highly adversely impacted by the pandemic and consequent implications for the value chain. So, Ms. Binu Wickramasinghe, my question will be, as a small supplier, how did you adjust to the COVID? Did you get any support from your government, from the brands and buyers? How did you cope with the challenge, and what are your expectations from the brands and buyers?
So to be very honest, in terms of the government, we had applied for the loan, but like what was mentioned in your presentation, not so companies who were basically doing, I would say, okay, like as a small company, they weren't really willing to give us a loan unless and until we had a massive amount of collateral to be given to the bank. And, you know, especially during a pandemic, we don't necessarily have that kind of a support, or we don't have that kind of monetary support at that point. So we weren't really able to get a loan. But I have to say, saying that yes, we did pull through, and yes, we are doing okay now. but it wasn't easy. Like if I want to share a little bit about my experience during the COVID pandemic. So as soon as it happened, first and foremost, none of us really knew how to react to this. And as a small company who houses, so my retail store houses over 60 brands who go across clothing. So it's apparel, accessories, shoes, bags, and so on and so forth. And this is more designer inventory, as well as, let's say, I wouldn't really go to the mass audience, but like I would say it's a little bit more design oriented. But again, it was interesting to see how customers reacted, as well as, let's say, the suppliers and of course the designers. Because to just start off, I think what we were mostly affected by was the fact that as soon as the pandemic happened, we didn't know how to kind of even if customers did order and our retail stores weren't open, we had online retail, which we had to, within a couple of weeks, we had to kind of put it online, get into e-commerce and kind of start selling online. But at the same time, we didn't have the kind of merchandise that the customers were looking for. And we didn't have a way of getting it manufactured either. So we had to work with what we had. Yes, like what has been said in this research, where we talk about how we have diversified into other categories, because we had sections like within the store, we, instead of in addition to apparel, we also had, let's say, other sectors in apparel, which was like, let's say, not only like, let's say, dresses and things for outgoing things, we also had like loungewear, which kind of helped us to kind of cope with the demand to an extent. We also had things which were related to skincare and things like that, which also helped us as well. But it wasn't an easy transition, because obviously there was, it was an adjustment period, I would say. So after the first lockdown, I would say things did pick up for us quite well. But the second lockdown was very crucial for us, because we did not recover from that one. Because as soon as the second lockdown happened, the customers stopped coming. Customers basically got scared as well, and they stopped purchasing. But less purchasing also means that the designers are not able to manufacture. So then that basically, like, let's say second lockdown, then obviously the season came up and, you know, things kind of got a little bit better. But then came the problem of the fact that Sri Lanka didn't have enough fabric, because obviously my designers, they can't afford to buy tons and tons of fabrics. They can't stock fabric. They didn't have the raw material required for their merchandise. So what happened at one point is that whatever they had, they used up. By the time the lockdowns and all that were getting settled, they had the problem because of the import bans and restrictions. They were not able to produce. So from one end, they were hampered in terms of like they couldn't get sales at the beginning. Now, when the sales are coming, they can't get the sales now because they don't have the fabric required for it. And smaller businesses, like what was said, they are not able to adapt as fast, because they are known, like especially when it comes to designer brands or smaller businesses, they're known for a specific type of fabric, or they're known for a specific type of embroidery or a color or something like that. And for those kind of things, it takes a little bit of time to kind of adjust. Yes, the designers did adjust, but by the time the designers adjusted, the customers had already changed. Because now we are going with a time where the designers and everybody at the store was concentrating so much on cottons and, like, let's say loungewear and things like that. Now they've moved on to, but the customers now have moved on to a different situation in Sri Lanka, because, you know, people are going to work and people are, you know, kind of getting out and about, and that whole trend has changed. The change in trend happens so fast that even for us as retailers, even after having 50 plus brands, almost 60 brands within a store, even for us to kind of adapt to this, it has been very difficult. But the whole situation with, like, let's say, the restriction of imports has really not helped us, because the designers are not able to find what they require, and they can't buy large quantities, and the cost of production goes up quite a bit if by chance they need to source everything from within the country itself. which is an ideal situation, of course, but it's not a very practical situation. It's a situation that I think the designers would have liked to get used to over a period of time, but not in such a harsh manner. And I think this is where we stand at the moment. And I have to also say that e-commerce was a huge game changer for us, because we obviously had e-commerce before, and the Sri Lankan customer base, only a very small percentage is actually using mobile phones and starting to purchase and things like that. So for us, I would say e-commerce was also a very good way to go about it, but it took a lot of time. I would say, like, let's say the first 1 month was literally about talking to customers and convincing them. So even after convincing them to purchase something, because of the lockdown, we, at most instances, we weren't allowed to like deliver these products. So in terms of, like, let's say the whole process, even from a retailer's point of view, the same way the supply chain was very hampered for the manufacturing side of things, even from a retail point of view, we had the same or similar kind of problems, because the government was also adapting, I understand, but at the same time, restricting everything didn't really help any of us. There had to be like a balance that needed to be struck, and also think about the small, medium enterprises, which were also trying to function. And I think that would be my take on this.
Thank you, Ms. Bino. I think your perspective is very important because in the apparels sector, there are many small entrepreneurs who cater to the niche market, as you have mentioned, and their capacity to adjust obviously is to that extent limited. You have mentioned about inventory management as a major issue, but you have also mentioned about the opportunities of e-commerce. But at the same time, you have mentioned that the first wave, yes, you could sort of recover, but then if it is a repeated wave, then obviously for small entrepreneurs it is that much difficult. Thank you so much for bringing that perspective. I would now like to bring in Mr. Pierre Borgeson. He is head of sustainability, global production, H&M. As I was telling you, H&M is world's, I think, largest retail giant, and in Bangladesh, obviously they are the major players. They sourced pre-COVID about $3.5 billion, which is about 1/10 of total export of Bangladesh in that year of $36 billion. But at the same time, we also know that H&M stands a bit apart in the sense that it was one of the very few retailers and brands which did not cancel orders, which Mr. Mustafizuddin was mentioning, didn't ask for deep discounts, didn't defer their orders, they fulfilled their commitment. So from that perspective, I think it will be very important to hear from a responsible brand like H&M. Mr. Borgeson, what do you think? Can we learn something from what we are experiencing and what we have experienced, and some of the proposals that has been mentioned in the paper? Can we have responsible sourcing? Can we look into the interest of countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and then reposition ourselves so that we don't do business at the cost of the small guys, as it were? What will be your take on that?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction there. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. Is yes. My sound okay?
Yes, yes.
Great. And of course we can learn. There is much to learn in the study, and there's much to learn from this situation. But first of all, I would of course like to acknowledge the workforce in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, but of course across the global value chain, which is a very vulnerable group of persons during a very pressured time like this. Coming a little bit to the study, and first of all, I would put it in a context where COVID has, of course, changed things. Some of the things that we have perceived for a long time in the industry that has been necessary to change, but also putting new light to things that are very critical for our industry. Digitalization, for instance, didn't start with the COVID, of course, but it has shown the importance for our full industry, both in the customer offer, but also in the way of doing business in the supply chain, the need for speeding that up and the need for accelerating and taking action on that. So COVID, that's just one of the examples. And COVID has exposed these vulnerabilities that is in our industry, the lack of digitalization, the lack of social protection for the workforce, and sometimes also a lack of sustainability in many parts of our industry, where the customers have become much more savvy and keen for demanding a sustainable product and a sustainable service from the brands that they are supporting. So COVID has shown the importance of speeding up things such as digitalization, such as sustainability, and creating a positive impact throughout the full value chain. Returning then a little bit to the study here, I think it's important to put it in a frame that the world is evolving and changing. The study speaks about pre-COVID and returning back to pre-COVID. You can say that the industry and of course the world has been disrupted many times, this time with COVID in a very rough and sudden way, an unpredictable way in the sudden moment. But I mean, the industries in various parts of the world has been disrupted many times before. Globalization has changed the way people are behaving in the way global supply chains are working, which has in some sense been to the benefit, for instance, to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I think it's important to speak about COVID not in terms of a sudden thing in history and in future and in the industry, and we need to work back towards how it was in the past, speaking about pre-COVID. I think it's important to look at it as an ever-evolving with its challenges and opportunities. Of course, COVID being a huge challenge for people and industries. But with that said, I think it's important for Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and all the markets to look at how the markets can become much more agile, flexible when it comes to different kind of product diversification, services connected to these products, and of course also addressing the sustainability, the impact that is requested and demanded by customers. And in that way, transform into something new rather than looking back on what it was in the past. And in that sense, actually achieving the possibility of creating more and different than how it was in the past. That I think is super important for all industries, so also for Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And again, especially when it comes to these vulnerabilities that has been exposed, such as the lack of social protection, making the workforce so vulnerable, and lack of payments that we have seen. And here, of course, like the study is alluding to, the whole value chain system has to work together in long-term partnerships, collaboratively, in order to set a new way of doing business. So I would like to really emphasize to not speak about rebounding and recovering to the same as in the past, but of course speaking about resilience in the sense of how do we form an industry that is responding to these kind of needs and necessities going forward, taking all different kind of parties into account, including individuals in the workforce, entrepreneurs as supply chain owners, brands, and how we can work with our purchasing practices, being a responsible partner, for instance, standing by the commitments that you mentioned here before. But there are other things as well, really making sure that brands and suppliers and the workforce can stand strong. To give two other examples, for instance, a supply chain financing program that H&M has launched and rolling out globally, enabling our long-term partners to have access to finance after order delivery already after 3 days, rather than different brands have different payment terms, 60, 70, 80 days and so on, but actually getting payments already after 3 days to a better interest rate than what local opportunities are often providing. Another example is something that the H&M Group recently launched, and it's a sustainability-linked bond where we are driving investments to climate-related projects and investments, advancing our industry into climate neutrality, and in that sense can collaborate with partners that have not yet been able to reinsert their investment money into climate-related projects if they have been paused or put on hold given the cash flow situation for suppliers throughout our global supply chain. And this is one way of how we can provide beneficial financing and support financially in order to not stop the development of a more climate resilient supply chain. I'm super happy to take questions or other comments. I'm sorry I've had some connection issues, so if there has been any direct questions to me or H&M Group that I represent, please repeat them, and I'm happy to take on such questions.
No, thank you, Ms. Borgeson. We have heard you loud and clear, and I think that your perspective and your approach, we do appreciate. You have mentioned about the need for adjusting on the part of the entrepreneurs and producers themselves, which is important. And you have said that change is always there, and it's an evolving scenario always. And COVID will have to be looked at from that perspective as well. But at the same time, it is also a sudden, disaster which has befallen, and neither the brands nor the entrepreneurs were ready for it. And we have seen also, to be honest, that how H&M has conducted itself and how some of the others global brands and buyers have conducted. There is a difference, at least from our perspective we have seen. So we appreciate how H&M has done, but at the same time, obviously we also understand that we will have to learn and also do the adjustments that we require. And you have mentioned about climate neutrality, and you have just not mentioned about that, but you have also mentioned how H&M is supporting those. And we know that some of the brands, in fact, were guarantors for the loans which our entrepreneurs were taking from the banks. So across the spectrum of the brands and buyers, we do see also differential, conducting during.
Can I add? I would like to mention one more thing here, also addressing the report in the study where it said that Bangladesh and Sri Lanka can take on the same kind of orders that other markets can do. To some extent that is correct, but it's important again to look at what markets that are offering the best deals. That includes the impact behind these products and a positive development for how we can support, whether that is chemicals, whether that is climate neutrality, but of course also social protection that again is so clear a lack in many of the markets that we as an industry, as a total value chain, has to approach and advance much more strongly. So again, and it's important to look at markets not just from a product perspective and the resilience of creating one product, but rather a resilience from a labor market perspective and what kind of entrepreneurial landscape that is offered from a legal perspective, from an investment perspective, from a skill perspective, and so on, that can respond to changes in the industry that is coming. Because again, the industry is not going back and forth, but everlasting evolving.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we appreciate that. Thank you. And your last point that I think what the study has proposed about shifting orders, what your perspective is that you are ready to support the entrepreneurs in our countries so that even in the context of a competitive pricing scenario, you have reasons to source from our countries if they can produce those products, but it will not be just as a charity. That's what I understand. Thank you very much. Dr. Mozem, is our ILO friend with us?
Yes, he's there.
Okay, okay. Mr. Craig Churchill?
No, Mr. Dan Rees.
Mr. Dan Rees. Mr. Dan Rees is Director of Better Work, ILO, and he's with us. I think that ILO is a very important player in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and many other countries, because one of the major stakeholder in this whole value chain is workers. And obviously, I think one issue which comes up in this type of discussion always is that, well, okay, we are asking the brands and buyers to be more helpful, to be more supportive, but does the incremental benefit automatically pass on to the workers? Because we sometimes argue that please help because it will help the workers, it will help the employment of workers, it will help their livelihoods, it will help their wages. But does it really happen like that? So the argument that if the brands and buyers come up with support measures, then it will help not only the sector but also the workers is not automatic. So Mr. Rees, from your perspective, we would like to know how do you look at this argument that if the brands and buyers are more helpful, then it will also pass on to the welfare of the workers as well. And what is your experience in the course of COVID with regard to the behavior of the various stakeholders in the value chain?
Thank you. And thank you to CPD and IPS for the opportunity to participate in the event, and indeed to the contributors so far. It's been a very interesting discussion, and may also offer warm greetings to friends and colleagues in Bangladesh, particularly as we begin the Ramadan period. So first thing I think I'd say, and I guess partly for full disclosure and as a disclaimer, this isn't a policy area where I can really relay an ILO policy position on. Some of these are new debates and some of these are contested areas between our constituents, but perhaps I can best answer by offering some personal reflections on, as I think you've asked me to do, on engagement with industry stakeholders on questions like this over the last 12 months that are really pertinent to some of the issues you've touched on in the presentation. So firstly, to say for sure, I think the value chain coming together with much greater purpose and unity to address some of the challenges set out in this presentation is a very important area to look at. There's power, and I personally believe unexplored potential in bringing together all the businesses in the supply chain and indeed with government and workers' organizations to tackle some of these issues. If we're talking about what's meant by building back better, if we're talking about reversing some of the shocking growth in inequality that we've seen over the last year, then surely we need nothing less if we're going to tackle some of these issues in the medium term and seriously. I've also no doubt that if there are more orders and there's some sort of pact that gives more predictability to manufacturers about future orders and order books, then it makes it far easier to them to be stronger employers and to build longer term systems of social protections and other things. After all, many people have been arguing that for years. However, in saying this, I also recognize some of the skepticism that Mustafiz referred to earlier. I actually find it quite hard in this moment to comment on the feasibility of the proposal, because I think there are many questions, and maybe the best thing I can do is to raise some of these questions and issues. I think the first thing I'd say is that the new resilience we need to see in terms of building back better in places like Bangladesh and indeed Sri Lanka go well beyond the role of business. If we're really talking about establishing new access to new rights and the social protection systems, and as I say, reversing inequalities, a step change improvement in wages that you referred to in your opening, then I think that this isn't just a supply chain issue, this isn't just a value chain issue, we're talking about some kind of quid pro quo between business and government. And I think if that's what you're hinting at, then I think that's a question that needs to be explored. To the point about fiscal stimulus and the relative strength of countries, I think the ILO has estimated that some 95% of the fiscal stimulus that's been deployed in the pandemic so far to ease the pain of the economic pain and to address the health crisis, some 95% of that has been spent in OECD countries. So maybe that tells us all we need to know about the relative position of countries like Bangladesh. But I also think, from my conversations with FIs and development banks over the last year, another view did emerge, that there is liquidity on the table for some countries, including Bangladesh, that could have been deployed. They've taken a more cautious approach. I think it's fair to say, if you look across the lower and middle-income countries, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than in the study. I think another question that arises for me out of the experience that the ILO's had over the last year is to ask a straight question. Is there a contradiction between a sector-specific approach and really addressing issues of long-term protection and addressing some of these inequalities at the level of the state? There has been an issue with governments that don't want to just implement these measures in one sector. In situations where we've gained act for countries where the government has been unwilling to roll that credit out because they can't answer employment insurance and all these things that the ILO is pursuing with its member states. So
have we lost Mr. Dan Rees?
Yes, yes, I think we can wait for a few seconds.
I think we can continue and hello, Mr. Rees, can you hear me?
I think it will take time for him most of the time like this.
Yeah, okay, I think the connection. Okay, thank you. I think if the connection is re-established, we can bring Mr. Rees. But I think the last point was making whether a sector-specific approach will be enough or there are structural issues that we should attempt. Dear audience, we had excellent and insightful comments based on their understanding, approach, experience.
Dan is returned.
Dan, are you there?
Yeah, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, apologies. My internet seemed to collapse, and I know we're running out of time.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So maybe just to finish off, I know we're running out of time, but I think on the issue of where I dipped out was, I think we do have to face a question of a strong sectoral approach, and I strongly believe that actors need to come together. But I think some of what's needed in terms of building stronger resilience and stronger rights and a stronger protection floor for workers maybe can't just be addressed at the sector level. So I think there's questions about broadening the alliance beyond a single sector. And then lastly, given the weakness of social protection systems, what's the role of different parties, I think is a really important question that you're asking at this moment in time. And I think, to be brief, I think if you ask the question, why hasn't Bangladesh, for example, got an unemployment benefit system or I suppose a universal employment injury scheme? And I think that, for years, I think there's been a reluctance of the sector to really extend those protections because they talk about the fiscal space. They talk about, is the price of the industry willing to bear it? Is the industry going to come with us? So clearly we need to build trust in the sector and cooperation in the sector to achieve that. And clearly we need to build a strategy and a longer term plan that gives the national constituents, the industry constituents, the confidence that that's something that could be there to stay and to be built sustainably into the industry. And indeed, give everyone the confidence that the institutions that are needed to transparently implement such a system are going to work effectively. And that there's long-term trust issues to address. And this kind of approach, I think, is needed in order to get after that. And maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. I think that these are very important, and your point, which I wanted to highlight, is your question that whether sector-specific approaches will be enough and whether we will have to look beyond. And that's also a very good point to bring in Professor Rehman Sobhan, the founding chairman of CPD. Sir has always argued that we will have to look at the deeper issues of injustice, both in country and also along the value chain. So we have 20-25 minutes for open discussion. So I'd like to request Sir to share his views briefly.
Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Unmute, sir.
Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Sir, red button to the chapter.
Yeah, I would to begin with. Yes, I think it is a very interesting study with some very interesting conclusions. Now, the main conclusion which came in with your with the little designs you did right at the end as to the solution, I have not seen anyone really address the answers to that in the commentary. Now, if I understood that, what was implied in that conclusion was that there has been some readjustment in the distribution of market shares in the pre and current or post-COVID, current COVID period, with market gains, particularly in China, but also slightly in Vietnam, and market losses for both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And in that third triangle, which was then put on the paper, you attempted to work out a suggested and implied response of returning to the pre-COVID situation, where the market shares of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka were restored at the expense of China and possibly Vietnam. Now, what no one commented upon was how this was to be brought about and the feasibility of such a global restructuring arrangement. Because obviously, two issues are missing in addressing that question. One is, of course, no one from China is participating with us in this discussion, and how they would actually respond to such a suggestion obviously remains unclear. But more materially, actually, there is no existing global architecture which would in fact actually bring about such a sort of mutual conclave where such an accommodation could actually be worked out. Because what we are essentially talking about is global demand management, where I'm not too sure that too much of that has actually taken place in contemporary history, or more specifically in relation to any particular big supply chains. So it would be interesting to find out how something like that could be brought about. And here I would be I was expecting, in fact, to get some response from the HN, our friend from HNM, and also from ILO, as to whether ILO would be willing to play an entrepreneurial role in bringing together OECD and the other big international buying countries and with the supplying countries to see if such a restructuring of the global demand chain could actually be put together on the one hand, and more simply at a market level, whether H&M would then, if such an exercise could not be carried out at the global level, would they be willing to in fact do that as one of the biggest buyers in the world? They would in fact be able to reaccommodate and restore the status quo ante on the lines actually suggested, so that both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka can in fact recapture their supply chains. Because this whole argument was based on the assumption that both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka were fully capable of in fact meeting their responsibilities if the demand was actually there, but it had actually been already occupied by China. Now, what the researchers, of course, also missed out, and I've sat in on a lot of the CPD and other dialogues, is to get any satisfactory explanation as to what was actually behind this recalibration of global market chains, moving in the direction of both China and Vietnam at our expense. What were the critical variables which brought that about, and how much of the corrective response is within the hands of Bangladesh itself? This, I think, would be a very important issue which needs to be researched, and I haven't really seen the evidence of that. The third issue, which I think remains under-researched, and no one has really addressed this, is that a lot of discussion has taken place on the impact of the change in the global demand structure and the level of demand on the workers themselves, which is rightly so, because they are the most vulnerable and the most victimized. And of course, what we have learned in the presentation is that a critical factor in adjusting to it would, of course, have been if the particular countries had a program in place of unemployment insurance, which would at any rate have provided institutionalized protection rather than ad hoc protection. Now, the ILO friend is, of course, suggested, certainly for Bangladesh, that this should very much be on the agenda. Now, ideally, Bangladesh would want to have a global unemployment system operating for the entire economy. But certainly for a country which has 80% of its exports attributable to ready-made garments, at the very least, there should be a tripartite exercise carried out between government, employers, and even for that matter, workers, to work out a mutually accommodating system of unemployment insurance for this industry to address not just the immediate impact of the COVID crisis, but longer term crises which may or may not arise. And finally, of course, I would like to get some sense. I haven't raised this issue in earlier dialogues, but I think we should all keep this in mind, that we do know that the main brunt of the impact has fallen on the workers. No one actually knows the degrees of resilience enjoyed both by the entrepreneurs, the manufacturers, also the buying chains themselves, in terms of how they have coped with these crises. I mean, are the employees and the shareholders of H&M, for example, standing in the bread line, and are your shareholders in fact facing severe constraints in their income as a consequence of what has been happening? Similarly, what is happening to our entrepreneurs, to people like Mr. Mustafazuddin and others, that have over the years the enormous earnings that they have had from the ready-made garment business seriously compromise their ability to maintain their current standards of living today as they existed in the pre-COVID period, or have they somehow managed to go on living because they have got accumulated resources and assets? This is not a question which has been satisfactorily answered, certainly in Bangladesh, and I imagine anywhere else in the world. But it is a question addressed both to the entrepreneur side of the supply chain and to also the buyers. I know, for example, that companies like Debenham have gone bankrupt, but others, in fact, seem to have managed quite well, including, I presume, H&M. And in fact, what degree of cost have they had to shoulder, both at the corporate level and also at the shareholder level, in relation to the particular problem that we have faced? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. As always, sir, the three research points which you have raised will help us to continue this very important work. And also, you have raised a very important issue about global demand management. We have seen how the developed countries have sir, ganged up in 1974 and they did the multi-fiber arrangement, and there was a quota system which was the demand management of a sort, and we found out that it was against our interest, and then the MFA was dismantled in 1995 to 2005. So it can, sir, work.
Could you get a
ways.
short response from our friend from H&M?
Okay. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Mr. Pierre Borgeson, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. There has been many good contributions in the conversation here. I'll quickly touch upon a few of them, knowing that
could you respond to my question?
Yeah, I will do that, yes. Knowing that the time for this event was supposed to end at 9 p.m., I believe, Bangladesh time. There are two things I will comment on there. I absolutely agree with you that the most vulnerable person has been the workers in the supply chain here. And there are severe inequalities in our global supply chains throughout the world, where all stakeholders, brands and buyers included, of course, need to contribute to positive developments in a more democratized and a more human rights oriented business and industry. I absolutely agree on that. So with such a situation as the COVID situation, it becomes prevalent and it becomes severe for the workers in the supply chain. So I'm not to argue that it has not been tough for this group and many other groups. It has absolutely been. With that said, of course, our business, like all the brands, have been severely affected from an economic perspective. During sometimes approximately 80% of all our stores were closed, and absolutely affecting the demand on our products and services. It is still in the aspect of the health and living conditions challenges that has been put on the workforce. It is not fair to mention how H&M has canceled dividends and decreased wages for senior management and so on. It is not the same context, as the people in the supply chain are facing much more severe challenges that the company economically has achieved or gone through, although it's been the toughest time in our history. So in that sense, you mentioned before that it seems like we have performed well. From a financial perspective, absolutely not. From going through a crisis like this, absolutely yes. I think we have navigated that. On the study that is also proposing to come together as brands, to go back to pre-COVID levels, particularly in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I again want to refer to my thinking around building back better. And potentially Bangladesh and Sri Lanka should have other levels, higher volumes and so on. But we need to look at how an industry is evolving and how customer behaviors is evolving to something new and nothing that will bounce back to the past. And here I think it's to the utmost important that countries like Bangladesh is working on developing a better labor market where there is collective bargaining agreements in place, where there is better living conditions offered to the workforce, annual review of wages, but of course also, like I mentioned before, the climate side of it, that production is much geared towards circularity and climate neutrality or positivity, so it's not on the expense of our resources in the world. Happy to discuss this more, knowing the time is short.
Yeah.
I will end there though.
No, thank you, Mr. Borgeson. Yes.
There is a question from Elizabeth Klein.
Yeah.
Let me read it here. Given that H&M's earnings for 2020 were 243 million, would the brand be willing to A, contribute more money directly to financial relief for supply chain, B, raise prices to responsible prices to support social safety nets while we are waiting for national social safety nets?
Okay.
Sure. Yes. So I would direct further that question, for instance, to, I'm happy to get it on email so we can respond more sufficiently on it. It's a large question, super important questions that we absolutely work with. So happy to address it if the person can contact with me in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Borgeson. One of the critics is that when we go for living wages, which the brands and buyers promote, when we go for insurance for the workers, which brands and buyers would like us to do, but if that is reflected in the prices, buyers are not ready to give those prices. So that's a common criticism, but you must have your own reasonings as well. Thank you very much. Are there any question from the floor?
Yes, yes, another question from Miss Aisha.
Yes,
she wrote, my question is for ILO colleagues on why the ILO call to action did not have any contributions from brands. Why does it always fall on governments and taxpayers to bail out workers, but brands never step up even though their price points are the ones that keep the workers in poverty, and in the pandemic, brands have bounced back to profitability while workers are being pushed towards hunger?
So it is for Mr. Rees. Are you there?
I am. I'm here intermittently. Thank you for your question, Aisha. The call to action has a statement that asks brands to pay their contributions, as you know, in terms of orders, and it maps out a collaboration between the stakeholders to seek greater access to credit in the short term and the building of longer term social protection systems. And the short answer to your question is why it includes those wordings and those clauses and that mission is because that's what the stakeholders negotiated when they fashioned this agreement out of the at the moment when the pandemic broke. So it's a different proposition to the Pay Up campaign. It's a different proposition to the ones put forward by NGOs on severance pay. It's absolutely not the same, but it is what it is, and it is what it says it is. And I really can't answer the question any other way, Aisha.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Rees. Thank you. Mozam, any other point?
You may ask to raise hand.
Yes. Are there anyone who would like to pose questions? Please raise your hand. Can you see anyone, Mozam?
No, I didn't see anyone raising hands.
Okay, then we can round up. Mozam, do you want to, or any of the panelists, if you want to have one last minute? If no, then Mozam, would you?
Yeah, I think thank you for the panelists for your very interesting intervention. And what major realization from my side is that I need to consider a dynamic point of view, more of a static perspective that I present. I think they need to have a dynamic context, which I think Mr. Husni initially mentioned, then later Pierre also indicated that. And what I really appreciate that a brand like H&M is quite positive to the suggestion made, but provided that this has some important social cause, whether it is in terms of the job, in terms of environment, in terms of the social protection, like that. So that also a dynamic perspective that I think we also need to take into account. And also, sir, also Raymond Suvanza, thank you, sir, for your important suggestions. I think we will take those issues into account. I think that will also, some of these things, I think we could also do some more research, particularly why the brand buyers look into China and Vietnam during this period instead of like countries like Bangladesh. So that we also need to dig more. And sir also suggested of a global demand management perspective. I think that is an important way this research could contribute in the future course of discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mozam. Thank you, Kitmina. Thanks to the team of authors of this very important work. And our fellow panelists, I think we had a very good discussion, a lot of insights, a lot of suggestions. I think that what clearly came out in 1 or 2 minutes, if I can summarize the takeaway, is that there can be 2 types of solutions. One is incremental, the other is radical. I think Mozam and his colleagues ended with a radical solution, which Sir Professor Eman Soban mentioned as global demand management. That's what will be needed if we want to do that. But my takeaway from the discussion and also the comments of the panelists, either from a point of frustration, as Mr. Mustafizuddin said, or the interventions by others, including our H&M friend, is that we are not seeing any radical solution. With regard to the last slide that Mozam has presented, the sort of global demand management which Sir mentioned, I myself is skeptic also that whether it is at all feasible, or some will also say desirable. As I was mentioning, in 1974, there was an attempt by the developed countries through quota system, and that we had protested, and so there are also various sides of that. But on the other hand, as Sir also mentioned, we need to do the homework with regard to safeguarding the interest of the workers through insurance schemes, through fiscal support. And of course, the brands and buyers have a responsibility with regard to that. As our friend from H&M mentioned, that they are ready to support those initiatives. But on the other hand, as I was mentioning, and which came up very, I think, explicitly, that taking responsibility for bringing back their, I think that brands and buyers will have their own limitations. I think the better of them, those will perhaps extend support to some of the initiatives, but apportioning markets, coming up with better prices in a competitive environment, whilst others are sourcing from lowest, that is, I think, something which is not sounding very feasible. But on the other hand, I think the supplying countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, if we can have a collaborative effort with regard to providing living wages, with regard to floor wages, I think that can also put pressure on the brands and buyers to come up with better prices. So we leave at that. Thank you very much, those who have stayed with us. I can still see about 43. We had at height of it, we had about 70. So thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, the authors. Thank you, IPS. Thank you, Southern Voice, for the support. Thank you, CPD. And I would like to conclude, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mozam,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafiz Bhai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafiz Bhai, for joining. Thank you, Mr. Hosni, for joining.